Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. ENO is an independent, nonpartisan, and nonprofit think tank that shapes public debate on critical multimodal transportation issues and builds an innovative network of transportation professionals. My name is Romic Aevaz, and I'm a policy analyst here at ENO. And today we're discussing best practices for transit data management and sharing with Laura Riegel and Cecilia Viggiano. Laura is the Director of Data Strategy in the Office of Performance Management and Innovation at the MBTA. Her role is to design and implement strategies to acquire, integrate, manage, govern, and share data to support effective data-driven decision-making across the MBTA and the Massachusetts DOT. Dr. Viggiano is a principal at EBP, where she helps lead the firm's public transit practice and contributes to transportation research across modes. She has particular expertise in public transit data and its role in planning. You can enter questions in the box on the side of your screen at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A at the end of this webinar. While we don't expect any tech issues, we found that exiting and rejoining the webinar tends to help any minor issues that come up for individual listeners. ENO is always happy to offer our webinar series free of charge. And if you enjoy our webinars and are interested in supporting our work, you can check out the link in the chat box to donate or become a member. You can find slides and a recording of the webinar on our website, enotrans.org. A recording will also be emailed to all registrants within a day. And with that, I will hand it over to Laura and Cecilia.
All right, thank you. I'm glad that so many people could join us today, and looking forward to talking with Laura about transit data. So we can go on to the next slide. Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about three main topics. So first, we'll discuss why share transit data, kind of talking about the benefits as well as some of the risks. Then we'll go into how you do that, what are the models for sharing data. And then we'll also talk about getting access to external data. So there are obviously a lot of interesting data sets out there that can be really useful for transit agencies and for transit planning. And so we'll talk about that as well. Next slide. So first, we'll talk about why share data, and also in some cases, why not. Next. So there are many kinds of data that transit agencies collect. It can be useful here. We've divided them up between data that reflects transit passengers, so anything from fare card transactions to security videos to more traditional data sources like survey data. There are passenger count data from when passengers enter a vehicle or enter a station. There's data on incidents, which can involve passengers. And then there's also a lot of data that comes from the system itself, whether that's planned schedule data or actual vehicle location data from buses and trains. There's maintenance data, there's financial data. So there's really a lot of different data sources. And these data sources have different risks, but they also have many benefits when you think about sharing them. So everything on the transit passenger side, if it is a type of data that can identify individuals, could have some privacy risks, but that can be ameliorated with things like aggregating data up to a higher level, or other ways to de-identify the data. There are a few other risks, but really the one, so just as a little bit of a side, a lot of the research that I'm presenting today is related to work that I did as part of a TCRP project, and I'll have a link at the end to TCRP report 213, and that's actually where this figure comes from. There's a lot more in that report in terms of all of these different risks and benefits, but today we'll kind of highlight just some of the major findings. And one of those points is that misuse is probably the risk that transit agencies are the most concerned about, or brought up a lot, because it is actually very challenging to share data in a way that it has all the documentation and information required for people to really understand what the data is and how to use it. So usually not malicious misuse, but just people that don't understand exactly how to use the data. But then on the positive side, and Laura will get into some of this in more detail, but there are a lot of benefits to sharing data. So everything from just increasing transparency, supporting innovation and research. And I think a lot of people are familiar with how transit agencies have shared their scheduled data using GTFS feeds, and that has really helped improve the customer experience through customer information. So there's really a lot of different types of benefits from sharing data. We'll go on to the next slide, and Laura will talk a little bit more about some of those benefits.
Sure. So I'm going to talk about some of the benefits from the MBTA perspective. So as Cecilia mentioned, one of the biggest benefits is the innovation and the research that can come out of sharing data. So we have a lot of partnerships with students and researchers that have done research projects using our data. We've also found that sharing our schedule and real-time data in industry standard formats has allowed other app developers to put out products for our customers that we don't have to. We can just provide the data and they can go off and innovate on these different kinds of apps. And in some cases, we have some data reciprocity with other state agencies where we have sharing agreements to share some of our data under sort of strict conditions and then get some back as well for some of our different partner agencies. And all of this goes towards improving the performance and the customer experience of our system as we're promoting transparency, because we're putting everything out there for people to look into as much as possible. Next slide. And there are some risks and costs associated with it, mainly the risks on some of the customer and personal data that we have, and we don't share things that can be individually identified to people. So we de-identify data and aggregate it to a point where there is no risk of a privacy concern, and that has helped a lot. And the other thing that Cecilia mentioned is just misuse of data, because a lot of the data we have is not perfect. We have some old systems that don't always work right, or we're using data that was originally intended for one thing to sort of get insight onto something else. And so there's a lot of ways that can have data errors and things like that. And we try to present all of the caveats in what we share, but a lot of times it's just a lot of built-in knowledge you have to be able to use the data properly. So we're concerned with misuse for that reason, that someone will do an analysis and sort of misrepresent what we have, or do it in a different way than we would have done and have a different result. So those are some of the risks. And on the cost side, there is a lot of staff time that goes into answering data requests and putting it on our open data portal every month or every so often as necessary. That just takes up a lot of time, but we find that the benefits outweigh the costs on that, and it's part of our job as public servants to share this data with everyone. Next slide.
So hopefully now we've kind of made the argument for why to share data, that even though there are some risks, there are also a lot of benefits. So now we'll get into how you share data. Next slide. So there are a lot of ways to share data, but broadly they can be categorized as either public data sharing or private data sharing. So on the public side, that's any method in which the data is available to everyone, to the general public. And this is really useful for some data types because it can promote that transparency. You might share data and it's used for some use case that you never even thought of, so it can really spur innovation. People can be really clever in the ways that they use public data. And also, as Laura was just saying, transit agencies respond to a lot of data requests. They're, as public agencies, they get freedom of information Act requests, FOIA requests, and so by just publishing some data publicly, that can actually save some time because instead of having to respond to each individual request, they can just point people to the public data. Of course, on the negative side, there's not direct control over how that data is used. So there could be some misuse concerns. Obviously, public data sharing is not a good option for anything that could identify individuals, so it would need to be de-identified or aggregated first. And then, I think Laura was getting to this too, that even, developing these kind of public data portals or dashboards, APIs, all of these things require a lot of effort. Then in terms of private data sharing, so this can take different forms, but generally it's anything with some kind of typically a non-disclosure agreement. It can be with a research partner or with a consultant. And so the data is usually shared for a specific purpose. So, the benefit of that is that it could, transit agencies can kind of ensure that it's used to support their goals and, the question that they're looking to have answered. But obviously that, for some data types that might seem less transparent to be sharing it just with one partner versus with the general public. Next slide. So as I was doing the research that I mentioned on data sharing for TCRP, I asked transit agencies sort of what was making data sharing difficult. And there are kind of a few different types of challenges. So one was internal organization. So essentially, if the transit agency is struggling to manage their own data, even for internal use, it's going to be very hard for them to have a organized and effective program for sharing data. So having staff with time that they can dedicate to data management is kind of a critical need. And I'll go in on the next slide a little bit more about what that can look like. Then there are also external needs. So one of the things that we discussed was kind of this idea of having standard protocols for how to manage data, and related to that, having data standards. So a lot of people are probably familiar with one of the most famous transit data standards, which is the General Transit Feed Specification, or GTFS. And as I already mentioned, that shares schedule data in a standard way, and that has been really helpful because whatever app developer or researcher can just use that data for apps that tell people when their buses are arriving or when they're or help them plan their trips, and all of that data, because it's in a standard format, the same apps will essentially work for for Boston or New York or San Francisco. So it makes all of that kind of innovation and all of those open source tools more efficient. So that's specifically for schedule data. There's also extensions, GTFS real-time, for example, for real-time location data. But there are other transit data sources that don't have a standard currently. And so I'm actually leading another TCRP project, TCRP G18, that is developing data standards for automated vehicle location, automated passenger counter, and automated fare collection data. And Laura's on the panel for that one. So we're working collaboratively with transit agencies to kind of develop standards for those historical data sources. And the idea is that will really help transit agencies be able to share open source tools and share management practices, and every transit agency won't have to be reinventing the wheel in terms of how to manage data. And then the last challenge on here, which Laura is going to talk more about, is that when you're sharing data, there is a lot of ways and levels that it can be aggregated. It can be really disaggregate data of individual events and transactions, or it can be more aggregated, and different potential audiences or users of the data have different desires for aggregation. So Laura's going to talk more about that. But first, on the next slide, I'll just go over quickly that first bullet I was talking about, this idea of developing, you need to have kind of an internal structure for data management. And so this is kind of one possible path to developing that. And so essentially starting by making sure that you have the staff who are focused on data and understand data, including the legal context. So we haven't mentioned that yet, but in that TCRP report 213, we did include a legal firm that kind of included some discussion in that report of, what does data sharing look like from a legal context? So mainly that there are these Freedom of Information Acts and that it's very state specific. So some states have different kind of provisions around transit data. So in some cases, certain forms of transit data that, whether it's, fare card data that's tracked to an individual are exempt from those, but that's not true in all states, just in some states. So it's really, you kind of need someone who understands the local legal context. And so, once you kind of have that staff, you have the people with the skills and the understanding, that's where you can really focus on what are the transit agency's goals and how does data fit into those. What data sets are important for different objectives, and and what role can data sharing play in that, and that is where that kind of helps transit agencies understand what their data and analysis needs are, and then from there, that's where you kind of identify the best data sharing models, whether it's public or private or some combination. Maybe different methods work for different data and for different objectives. Next slide. I'll turn it over to Laura again.
Yeah, so as Cecilia mentioned, one of the challenges that we've had is figuring out what level of aggregation to share data on our open data portal and our dashboards, our public dashboards. And we started off with looking at a lot of the data requests that we often get and trying to sort of get to the lowest common denominator to provide the most disaggregate level that we could while still protecting privacy, and just share it that way, figuring it would sort of cover everyone's needs. So that's kind of the data repository column there, which really allows anyone to manipulate the data however they want, to do their own analysis and sort of figure out whatever they want from the data. We did find though that was still difficult for sort of non-technical audiences, or we got a lot of press requests and we'd say just go to the open data portal, you can find everything there, but it was really like they just wanted to know what is the typical ridership at one station. They don't want to have to download a ton of data and aggregate it themselves, and sometimes the data was so big that they couldn't even use Excel to do that. So it was a bit too onerous for some types of users who just wanted like a quick piece of information. And so we actually share data in all of these ways. So we started doing more of the static reports once we got a bit more mature with our open data portal, and actually published some just static PDFs with typical questions that we get and more descriptions of the data that we have. So that's a lot more accessible to the non-technical audiences and provides some just sort of quick win information. And it also protects against people sort of misinterpreting or aggregating our data incorrectly. It's kind of like a standard reference data set for some of our most common questions. We also have interactive dashboards on our MBTA Back on Track site, and that allows people to sort of dig in a little bit deeper from our high level information. So we have ridership and reliability data there, and you can dig into different transit modes and different particular dates. And we don't allow you to download data from that site, but we do publish all of the underlying data on our open data portal. One of the cons on that one is that it does take a lot of effort to develop those kind of dashboards and also to keep them up to date and keep them maintained so that they don't become stale. And then finally, we also have APIs for our performance data, and our customer technology department also puts out a lot of APIs for our other real-time location and alert and prediction data. And that allows any developer to sort of pull that data into their apps and do whatever they want. And that's really great, especially for the more real-time data, the things that you want to get very frequently. So we've found that we sort of had to publish our data in all of these ways to kind of fit each of the needs that we get requests on all the time, because sometimes we'll just get press inquiry where they could easily look something up in a static report, but then other times we have students who are looking for really detailed information for them to be able to do sort of machine learning type things where the data repository of like a big bulk set of historical data or some of the APIs are more appropriate for that. So we've sort of moved into a model of trying to meet people where they are and providing data at different levels of detail and aggregation so that we can fill all of those needs. Next slide.
All right, so now we'll change gears a little bit to talk about how transit agencies can access data from external entities. Next slide. So first of all, there are kind of a couple different types of external data sources. A lot of them are publicly available. So census data, household travel survey data, there's some public weather data. There are also a lot of different GIS layers that typically, states or MPOs will publish as well. And so all of these are data sources that often are used by transit agencies, are useful for transit agencies, and can just be accessed through public availability. But then there are also a lot of private data sources that can be really useful for transit agencies in terms of understanding how people move around, how they're getting around if they're not using transit, how they're getting from their home to the transit stop or from the transit stop to work. And so this includes kind of any of these different mobility data sources, whether that's from a smartphone with location-based services, whether it's from a specific app data, so how users are interacting with a transit planning app or a transit fare payment app, or private mobility apps. So whether that's a Uber or Lyft app data, would be very interesting to a transit agency. And then there are other sources as well, like credit card data gives a lot of information about how people are moving around and spending their time, and other geospatial data sets as well. Next slide. So how do transit agencies access these data sets? So there are a few different options. Probably the most straightforward one is just to purchase the data, which is an option for several, not all of those data sources, but several of them can be purchased. The other one that is kind of starting to happen pretty frequently are when transit agencies are in a service partnership with a private mobility provider. There is often some kind of data exchange. So this is, for example, if a transit agency has partnered with Uber or Lyft or Via or another company for late night service, or maybe for more suburban service accessing rail stations, typically there's some kind of agreement for that company to share data on those rides. Those have we found a lot of different examples in our research. Sometimes the data sharing component had really evolved over time as the transit agency worked with the company for longer and kind of developed a relationship. In other cases, it was sort of meticulously negotiated before the service agreement went into place. So that really requires a lot of expertise on the transit agency side in terms of kind of going through every single field and the level of aggregation for all the data that they want as part of the service partnership. There are also some examples with third parties involved. So, for example, the city of Cincinnati has this Uber mobility lab where they have kind of partnership with Uber and the city and the transit agencies are all providing data to a third party, which in that case is a consulting firm, and that third party sort of has access to all the data and can produce reports based on that, but the data isn't directly shared between the two, between the various transportation providers. There are similar partnerships or third-party agreements with universities and nonprofits as well. And then sort of the fourth method that is occurring is that there are sometimes regulations or legislation in place in some cities and states that actually require private mobility providers to share some data on the usage, within that jurisdiction. And so transit agencies themselves typically don't have the authority to do that, but could potentially work with a city or state government to kind of institute that kind of legislation. So I'll move on to the next slide and hand it over to Laura.
Yeah, so I will just talk specifically about one of those, the purchasing of data. So we purchased streetlight data actually through our MassDOT, where OPMI, the office I work in, is a shared service between MassDOT and the MBTA. And we originally purchased streetlight data for some of our bike ped work because it, at the time, was the only vendor we found that could do some modal allocation for bicycle and pedestrian travel as well as auto travel, and we were trying to update some of our bike ped planning, and then we also ended up being able to use this data for a lot of our MBTA use cases. And Streetlight also has a transit module that's kind of in beta that we're working with them to sort of QA. So one of the things that we're really excited about with the Streetlight data is it gives us an overall picture of travel demand, not just on the transit network. So we're hoping that eventually we'll be able to get to really precise mode share calculations on specific corridors and for the state as a whole. We also are using it for our bus network redesign because we wanted to totally sort of reimagine our bus network based on where the overall demand of travel is in the region, not just on our network, because we wanted to see sort of like where people are starting their trips, where they're really going versus where we're providing service right now. And we have a lot of our own data that we process through an origin destination inference algorithm, but that really only starts like where our network starts. So the Streetlight data has a lot of benefits to provide sort of like where people are actually starting and ending their trips. So we're using that to redesign our network. So we've had a lot of benefits from actually purchasing that data where we couldn't get that from our own internal data sources. Next slide.
So just to summarize kind of the takeaways from our presentation today, there are a lot of different benefits to sharing data. So, hopefully Laura provided some examples from the MBTA, and, they're everything from kind of improving the customer experience to promoting transparency, supporting a lot of research that, produces some interesting findings for transit agencies. Then there are also different ways to share data. So, different models sort of fit for different objectives and for different audiences and users of the data. So, most transit agencies kind of end up sharing their data in a lot of different ways. Then, on the external side, it can be a little costly to purchase data or even to, negotiate access to external data, even if it doesn't involve a monetary purchase, it still involves some, time and effort. but there are benefits there too in terms of kind of understanding the overall mobility picture and not being limited to just the transit usage perspective. Next slide. So I mentioned this one at the beginning, and I said I'd provide the link. So if you want to learn more about data sharing, and there's actually a little kind of guidance chapter in here with some how-tos. This is TCRP Research Report 213 that was published about a little over a year ago, I think. And then, if you want to contact us, here are our emails as well. So thank you. And I think we have some time for questions now.
Yes, thank you so much, both of you. This was a really interesting presentation. We've got lots of questions. So we can get started. We had a couple questions. We talked a lot, heard a lot in the presentation about management and reporting, but we had some folks who were interested to learn more about data quality control and what some best practices are in ensuring that quality control and assurance is done with the data, and how that factors into agencies' data management plans.
I can start, although I'm sure Laura has more specifics, but this has actually come up a lot in the other TCRP project that I mentioned, G18, where we're developing these data standards, because part of that process is how do you clean the data, and then do you maintain the original unclean data as well as the clean data, because sometimes for one type of performance indicator you really need to address, for example, if you're looking at headways and you have a missed trip, and that doesn't have data, a trip that ran but doesn't have data, really it messes up all of your headway calculations. So you're going to need to do some kind of inference, some kind of cleanup there. But then that same data set might be used for something else where you don't really want to use the inferred data. You want to just limit it to the actual data. So one of the things we've been talking there is about kind of flagging data issues, but not deleting erroneous data, so that you kind of have the original data, but if you've cleaned up a row or done something, you have that option as well.
Yes, for the MBTA side, especially for our reliability data, as Cecilia said, we have an API that puts out our reliability data in real time, and that is sort of processed as much as it can be that day. And then overnight, there's a post-process that runs that sort of cleans it up even more. And then we just publish the post-process version. And internally, we save the original with sort of things marked as suspect or flagged for those reasons. But when we put out the published data sets on our open data portal, we try to make them as clean as possible and provide some data caveats and sort of disclaimers that say, like, this isn't guaranteed to be complete or always right, but it's sort of the best information we have. And we have some monthly processes that we do and just some automated scripts that run off of the source data that clean up things that we find regularly to prepare it for publication. So we have to do a lot of work in advance to sort of get things ready to be able to publish them.
That's really helpful. We've had a couple other questions about kind of the impact of the pandemic as it relates to data management and analysis. And the questions kind of come in two prongs. The first is how COVID changed your data reporting, your sharing practices. So whether there was a new sharing with public health agencies, or new demand to track, train capacity or other additional metrics that, the pandemic has prompted agencies to consider. And the second has to do with kind of how the future of data planning, particularly for service planning purposes, and whether there are changes in the types of data sources and their utility that agencies might be experiencing when it comes to thinking of how you're planning for service post-pandemic. So either of you want to take either parts of those questions?
Yeah, I can start and try to
those
answer
two.
both, but I might ask you to repeat the second question.
Yes.
There's a lot there. So we found that at the start of the pandemic, the ridership data was obviously super important, and we always sort of calculated ridership data, but I don't think it had as much of an internal focus. It wasn't really one of the main things we tracked. We were much more focused on reliability type of data prior to the pandemic. So I think one of the things that it has done is sort of like pushed forward some of the projects that we had planned to kind of manage all of our ridership data in one place, because we really had a need to track it like the next day, whereas we used to do it sort of on a monthly basis. So that really pushed forward those types of things. And then on the customer facing side, we hadn't really been able to put out any sort of crowding information before because we didn't get our APC data in real time, but our customer technology department did a lot of work and our ops tech department did a lot of work to get some real-time crowding information that we can push out to customers on all of our bus routes, and then some sort of typical trends for the subway as well. And we're really hoping to be able to use our APC data from our new trains in the future as soon as we can do that. And I think on the second question, sorry, can you repeat the second question again?
Yeah, so the second question has to do with just new service planning considerations after the pandemic. And are there any new types of data sources or changes in how useful traditional forms of data that would inform those decisions? Have there been any changes in that realm, kind of as we think about service planning after the pandemic?
Sure. So we're still using a lot of the same data sources that we always have. We're seeing sort of shifts in the peak time, so we don't have as peaky of peaks, and we're kind of expecting that to continue. We also have more like of a percentage of our ridership happening in the midday, so that is also informing our service planning decisions. We're using surveys a lot to be able to track when we expect people who are still teleworking to come back. So we have our monthly customer panel survey, and then we've also got an employer panel survey and some other surveys that other agencies are doing that we're kind of tracking. And we're still seeing what people anticipate to be a big jump in September. So we're kind of preparing for that. And then additionally, we're using our streetlight data, which we get for tracking all of our travel modes kind of a month behind. They usually send updates every month to be able to track places where we may have cut service a bit or cut back service a bit during the pandemic, but trying to get a read on if people are traveling by other modes along those corridors where we've cut service, so we can see like, oh, we might not have a lot of ridership data there because we've cut our service back, but there are people traveling there. Maybe we need to put service back in those particular locations, where that's sort of the best way to track it when we're not running the service now, so we can't really see what is happening there from our own data.
Yeah, maybe one other thing to add is that I think the topic of equity in transit service has become even more prominent during the pandemic, in terms of it really revealed who was dependent on transit to get around. And I think so we've been doing some work for the Atlanta region for their annual report. And one of the things that we've been looking at is access to, to jobs, but also to grocery stores and to healthcare, and specifically kind of trying to overlay that data with information on, from the census and other sources on who uses transit as their primary mode, what kind of jobs require in-person participation, and then other equity indicators like income and race. And so kind of pulling all of that together, I think was always part of transit service planning, but is becoming even I think it's just become more important in terms of trying to make sure that the transit service is filling that really vital role.
Yeah, I definitely should have mentioned that. With all of the data we get from our MBTA sort of passenger census data that we did a few years ago, tracking sort of who's riding what service and their different demographic characteristics, we also get some of that information from our streetlight data based on what we've sort of determined as like a transit critical population. So we're tracking all of our measures with an equity lens as well. So we're moving away from having specific equity measures just on their own, but having just like recalculating each measure with the equity populations on their own so that we can make sure that it's not a disproportionate impact on those populations.
That's helpful. My next question is going to be specifically about equity metrics. So I think both of you cover that really well, and some exciting new developments, and definitely agree that that's definitely been a consideration kind of in the wake of the pandemic. I'm going to shift kind of back to the closing point about third-party data sources and how agencies can use that type of data. I know, Laura, you mentioned the streetlight data example, and we have a couple questions about what are some of the barriers that agencies might face, whether those are workforce or software or financial considerations, in being able to access and incorporate that data into their service planning decisions. And I don't know if there's any examples from your experience acquiring that data, or experiences from peer agencies who've been interested in taking that kind of approach.
I can say a little bit from from the interviews that I did as part of that project. There are definitely barriers to accessing that data. And one of them is actually kind of related to the legal issues. One of the rationales that private mobility providers will give is that they don't want to give any data to the transit agency that can identify individuals, because transit agencies are subject to the Freedom of Information Act requests. And I think there's that's certainly not the only barrier, but there are, I think that has sort of motivated some of states or advocacy groups within different states to actually develop those exemptions. So make it so that the data can be shared with the transit agency, and the transit agency is exempt from sharing the disaggregate individual data with the public, because what basically has happened is that the legal system is kind of slower to move than the technology, and so as these new technologies develop, and even just like smart cards have been around for a long time, but most states don't have specific legislation around that data type because it's still relatively new in like the overall context of data. And so, it just kind of takes time for those exemptions to get put into place.
Thanks, Cecilia. We had another question, a little bit more specific, about whether either of you are aware of any recent work or best practices in developing data standards for demand response transportation, including paratransit or microtransit, and to what extent are some of those standardization efforts different or similar to some of the more not general, but ones that you'd use for otherwise more traditional forms of service?
Yeah, so there's the mobility data specification. I believe I'm getting that right. That was developed out of LA, but has been adopted various places, which focuses on kind of like all the various kind of private, I think it's micromobility as well as like ride hailing type services, sort of to provide that data in a standard way for public agencies. And then there's also the general bike share feed specification, GBFS, for bike share data, which is mostly kind of focused on, you know, where the bikes are. So it's pretty useful from a customer information perspective in terms of like being able to incorporate data from multiple bike share companies or systems in the same, you know, types of apps or framework for people to kind of know where the bikes are. I think both of those are less useful in terms of like historical analysis or like kind of the types of like planning analysis that that, you know, someone who's trying, that a transit planner or you know, someone working at an MPO might be interested in.
Thanks, Cecilia. On that note, Cecilia, we had some questions of folks who are curious to learn more about the TCRP report that you're currently working on, and you know, I think folks who are just interested to hear more about, you know, what are some of the potential new data sources or new uses that could be unlocked with the new standards that you all are looking at as part of that work. And I think folks just want to hear more about, you know, what that entails. What are data sources that could fall under or that are ripe for, you know, development of new standards across agencies.
Yeah, so I mean, there are probably a lot of data sources that could use standards. So this TCRP G18 is specifically focused on vehicle location, passenger counter, and fare collection data. So kind of the three standard ITS data sources that transit agencies collect. And we're focusing more on kind of the historical data. So really kind of on that predominantly internal use by transit agency staff, but to support the estimation of different key performance indicators. So in the first phase of that project, which is complete, we talked to a lot of transit agencies. We had a workshop, and the KPIs that kind of came to the forefront were really about ridership and about on-time performance. And so we're trying to ensure that the data structures support estimation of those KPIs, which are certainly things that would be often reported out in various ways. And so, yeah, we're kind of working through how do you organize the data, how do you support different levels of aggregation, because different transit agencies, you know, some transit agencies collect really disaggregate raw data and others don't. So yeah, I don't know if you wanted to, Laura's on the panel, so she can also say.
Yeah, I think one of the goals of having a data standard is, so in the same way that a lot of tools and apps and websites and things have been built off of the GTFS and GTFS real-time standard, having these data part of a standard that sort of all transit agencies, regardless of their size, can comply with. And maybe there will be some developers who come up with some open source tools that can help agencies like easily report this kind of information or calculate these KPIs. Then it unlocks a lot of potential for a lot of the sort of smaller agencies that don't have, you know, a big staff of people doing this kind of analytic work. They can also have access to some of these tools that maybe were built for a different agency. So that's, I think, the sort of overall dream is to have those kind of tools available to everyone and kind of like share in that innovation with the standard.
That's really interesting, and I think all of us are very much looking forward to seeing the findings and seeing some of the work that you all come up with as the project gets finalized. So just going to close with a couple other questions, kind of keeping an eye on the clock here. I know earlier in the presentation, you both covered some of the challenges and hurdles that come with standing up a robust data reporting and management process or system at an agency. And there were some questions about either from your own experience at through your respective agencies and work, or just through best practice research. What are some of the ways that you've seen agencies overcome some of the workforce or tech literacy or financial challenges that come with standing up a robust data processing or reporting system? And what are some advice for agencies that might be struggling with standing those up, and some good first steps to take to be able to at least harness the power of some of the internal data that they have?
I think what we try to do is sort of keep track of all of the data requests that we get, and try to see how many hours we spent just fulfilling these sort of ad hoc data requests, because it added up to a lot. So once we had that and were able to sort of show what the benefits could be of providing data in a more sort of standard place that anyone can just go to, and then once we started getting some more data requests and just being able to point people to our open data portal instead of having to go through a whole thing with staff time to analyze something as a one-off again, I think that helped a lot. So I think really just being able to sort of quantify and enumerate what those benefits are for your agencies, and start small with like the most requested thing that you get, and try to put that out there and see if it works and saves you time overall. It's a lot of upfront work, but then I think over time it will save time in the end.
Yeah, I think a couple other strategies that especially smaller agencies use. So one is to kind of collaborate with other agencies. So, a small transit agency can also collaborate with the data people at the city or the MPO. And so, maybe each of those agencies only has one or part of a person focused on data, but if the three collaborate, there's a little bit more of a group of data focused people who can work together. And the other one, which obviously requires some resources, but is research partnerships. So in our grad school days, Laura and I were both involved in research partnerships that MIT has with the MBTA and with Transport for London. And so, I think that those kind of partnerships really expand the technical resources that a transit agency has. And, it's a little different perspective, because researchers are going to, work a little more slowly probably, but work on kind of projects and topics that maybe the transit agency staff just, doesn't really have time to focus on, because they're dealing with more immediate concerns.
Yeah, we've also gotten a lot of use out of our intern programs. So partnering with universities to get some interns or co-op students that can help with sort of specific projects around this, and have a lot of skills coming out of school that maybe aren't in the transit agency. So I think that has also been a real benefit to have a program like that.
That's really great. In the interest of time, I think I will stop there with questions. But again, thank you, both of you, one for a really great presentation, but also for this great Q&A session. Both of you have tons of unique case studies and experience and insights from your respective work and research that I'm really happy we got to share with all the folks on the phone and tuning in. So again, thank you both of you for joining us, and thanks to everyone who's on the line for attending today's webinar. As I mentioned, you'll be able to find the slides and a recording of the webinar on our website, enotrans.org, and a recording will be emailed to all of you within a day if you are registered for this webinar. Make sure to sign up for our mailing list to gain access to the free Connector newsletter, webinar announcements, report releases, and more. We are, again, happy to offer our webinar series free of charge. And if you enjoy these webinars and are interested in supporting Eno's work, you can check out the link in the chat box to donate or become a member. So again, thank you to both of you for sharing your time, and to the audience for submitting such great questions and participating. Make sure to sign up for our next webinar on COVID mobility adaptations on July 8th. But beyond that, I hope everyone has a great afternoon and enjoy the long weekend coming up. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.